Hello everyone, and welcome to the Gwent expansion poll results. It is going to be a very, very interesting set of data here. I'm really surprised by some of the information. I thought it'd be a little bit more cut and dry than this, but the results are in. Over 1,700 of you, actually no, just under 1,700 of you responded to this individually, which is really, really cool. It's a lot of data, a lot of information that I will be sending over to the CDPR team for them to take a look at so that, your voice is heard. It was a question I'd been pondering in terms of expansion cycles. How are they going? And it's a great time to review this as we are about to start Harvest of Sorrow, the last section of the current expansion cycle. I love the cards that have been revealed over the course of this expansion wave, and every time I look at them, especially the newest set, I look at them and I think, what could have been if we'd had more pieces of the puzzle together? How many more entertaining metas would we have had if things had evolved? But that is just my opinion. What do you guys think? Well, this is exactly what I have sent over to the CDPR team. So, there were 1,684 valid responses. By valid responses, that is people who answered all of the questions and that weren't duplicates, effectively. And here we have, so the majority of people who answered were actually in pro rank. Now, that isn't necessarily reflective of the overall Gwent community. In fact, I would say it definitely isn't reflective of the overall Gwent community. But it is reflective of the people who spend the most time in Gwent and who are probably most affected by the meta. So it doesn't really surprise me that this is the case. The poll itself was advertised, obviously, on my Twitch channel, on my Twitter, but it was also on Reddit. It was available in various Discords. It was talked about on Twitter as well by Vlad, Thor Serpent, and many other content creators as well. It was also on the Play Gwent forums. So there was a decent range of places that you could have found the poll. YouTube as well, actually, now I think about it. Hi, YouTube. But obviously, the more people that answer this kind of thing, the better. It's not the kind of thing, it wasn't in-game for you to answer. So a lot of players who play more casually, who aren't really involved in the wider Gwent ecosystem, would probably never have found this, probably aren't even that fussed by it necessarily. But that's the overall percentage, and you can see a huge chunk, nearly, over 85% of responses are rank 5 and above. But they're the people who are probably playing the game most, so it doesn't really surprise me. Now, this is big. This is the big question. Do you like the current style of content release? Now, overall, the biggest answer, 39.5% of people said yes. In total, yes, 39.5% of people do like the current 2-month cycle. Which means then that 60.5% of people do not like the current cycle. So, not quite 2/3 of people dislike the current cycle, but they don't agree on which version of new Gwent content that they like. Some of them, and it's very close between these two, just 10% would like to revert back to the old expansion cycle. 9.9% of people wants to go back to 2 full expansion drops, 1 every 6 months, and exactly like we had previously. Now, that would certainly not be my preference, albeit if I'm being completely honest, I think it felt a lot healthier than what we currently have in terms of meta balance, because in reality, it is a bit disingenuous to say we had a drop and then 6 months of nothing. That literally never happened. We had leader reworks, individual events with specific cards like Maddock dropped in that was synergized with Journey that made big differences. It also gave more time for bigger patches for old content to be reworked. So it is a little disingenuous to say that's what they used to do. I think the problem with the way it used to happen was that we didn't have like roadmaps, so we weren't really sure what we were getting. So it felt like we had less than we did because we were never sure when we were getting it. Now that that's not the case, honestly, I think I would prefer it. But it would definitely not be my choice. I went into this thinking, split expansions are fine. Maybe we switch to, in theory, we're having 2 expansions a year like we are now, but we get 2 drops instead of 3. So we get that 3rd month where a natural meta can evolve. It would give more time for things like a PTR, which is crucial because in the 2-month expansion cycle, there is so little time for testing because it's either make the cards or put the cards ready like to be launched kind of thing, so it's a much smaller window. It would also deal with a problem that we're about to face. Current expansion cycles have us having an expansion in December. Now, Masters is in December, so you will get World Masters first, then the expansion usually drops a few days after Masters, which sounds great. Over the Christmas and New Year period, quite rightly, the dev team take a break. They're on holiday, which is exactly what should be happening. But historically, whenever we've had an expansion drop in December, obviously you're not really getting any sort of patch over the January period, which means we're going to have an entire expansion cycle with no intervention. Now, that's potentially quite worrying because if there are any issues or there are overtuned cards or undertuned cards, which there is an inevitability that there will be, in the current 2-month model, we are guaranteed that whatever happens, like the December launch, any problem we have for the entire expansion cycle, which I'm not the biggest fan of. A 3-month cycle would prevent that because you could launch the expansion in November, you could then have the patch in December just after Masters, and then January would be what would ideally be the light touch anyway, so it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, and I think that would certainly help. It's fair to say that they've dropped expansions before in December as well, in spite of this, and I completely agree. They have. I just don't think we should. I think it would be a lot easier not to do that, and this would enable us not to do that. I think it would be much more sensible not to do that as well, personally, anyway. And maybe there's a reason they do that. They want newer content out over the period where they're not intervening. For play rate and stuff over a period where people have spare time. Personally, I think I would prefer not to see it because of the historic problems we've had. Some of Gwent's bigger exoduses over the years were caused in no small part by like midwinter and stuff like that. So yeah, so this is what I initially thought. I thought the switch to a split expansion and doing it that way and having a drop every 3 months, that was what I voted for. I wasn't originally putting in the option of having 3 dedicated expansions a year, but 1 every 4 months. Now, it's in terms of cards, I'm talking total amount of cards doesn't change over the year. So whether it's an expansion and you get a third of it every 2 months, or you get an expansion every 6 months, or whichever one of these, the total cards and the total dev workload has to stay the same. Because it needs to be a realistic possibility that we're voting for. It's all well and good saying, yes, I want an expansion every 2 months, but I want 80 cards every 2 months, and I want them all to be good, and I want... So, I would like... Yeah, that's a very important point to put across. But the more I think about it, the less I like split expansions. Because there's an inevitability with split expansions. All the cards are designed as a synergistic package. So we are currently in the final stage of Price of Power here, and there are some really interesting cards coming into the game, and you look at them and think, oh, okay, you have synergy with a card that was released 2 or 4 months ago, but we're not really going to experience the development of that meta in the same way we could have done or would have done, because the cards, we're getting chunks of them. Now, in the 2-month cycle, the biggest chunk problem that I see is if the 4 cards you're getting aren't enough to carry the faction, then the faction itself appears to not be very playable. Scoia'tael in the first drop was dead faction because it just didn't have the power. And SK and Northern Realms throughout a good chunk of this have been in a similar spot because they didn't have the final pieces of the puzzle. Well, all of a sudden now, we don't have the NR pieces out as of this, but the SK pieces with actual payoff for Rain, Ryogun and Fuxia, you're looking at it going, oh, that makes sense. And all of a sudden, there is a potential to that. Is it going to end up being meta? Who knows? But it feels like as a result of that, maybe power creep has to be more influential because there are only 4 cards. I don't like the concept of 4 cards being dropped in and that's all. I think a wider range of cards overall would be good for the game. But yeah, the overall response has been 39.5% of people want to keep it this way. The remainder do not, but don't agree on how to change it. Okay, I can see PTR is only useful when you listen to the testers. Westphalian, I'll put it to you like this. From experience, the PTR, even as short as it is right now, because of deadline launches and stuff like that, you have no idea how many things change in the PTR. You guys have no idea. So much gets changed on the back of that feedback. I can promise you that. When the PTR takes place, things change in terms of ability, power, provision, consistently and constantly. I don't ever remember any being involved where there weren't several notable changes. So believe me when I tell you, they do listen, in the same way that when we asked them to change expansion content style, they listened. We asked for the 2-month cycle, we asked for more frequent content, and we got it and they delivered. Now this, as I say, was the evaluation of how we feel about that. So the final question. So overall, a huge chunk of the players are rank 5 or above that have answered this, which kind of makes sense. 60.5% of people do not like the current style, but don't necessarily agree on how, and it is pretty much split between still splitting expansions or having 3 dedicated expansions a year, which is the one I've ended up leaning towards personally. I think that would be much healthier for the game. You would have the ability for a less developer-led meta. You would have cycles and more PTR time so that you could make sure things went in a better state. The meta would naturally be able to evolve in a way that I think is really good and organic for a card game, because we never have time for a counter meta now. But we will see. The final question then, do you want reworked old cards as part of expansion content? So the original answer is no. Now, one of the first answers was no, and now the no answer, and this is just my assumption, but I don't think anybody anywhere doesn't want to see old cards that aren't being played reworked. So I interpreted the answer no as I want it nothing to do with expansion content and I want it as a separate thing. Now, I can't imagine the correlation of people who voted no being able to like this version of the expansion cycle, because there is never going to be time in that model to do it that way. And then the 2 options are yes, and support the new archetypes. So, for instance, let's rework some old cards in Skellige and give them additional rain synergy for the expansion that we're in right now. That's kind of what those people want, and that's what the vast majority of people want. Over 56% of people like the idea of reworking cards and packaging them with current, like, newer expansion stuff to support the archetype that expansion is doing. And I think if you went for either the current cycle or either of the newer versions, I think this could work really well, because it would reduce the limitations of having so few cards in the game. But bear in mind, reworking a card is almost as much work for the dev team in terms of either changing abilities or bringing it back up to play rate, making sure it sits at the right point in the meta. It's just as impactful and just as much work. The only thing that changes is the art, and in a lot of instances, because they don't need to make new art, obviously, but that's usually outsourced to an extent anyway, so balancing isn't as easy as people perhaps interpret it to be. It's not as simple as, oh, just give it a provision or 2. It really isn't as easy as that, and we need to kind of understand that. But that does seem to be the biggest selection of choice. The next one, about 35% of people say, yes, we want new cards, we want them reworked, but we don't want them to support the archetype of the new cards. Now, that would look a little different. So, again, I'll take Skellige as an example because it's easy. Sure, Skellige's current new cards are coming in supporting kind of cultists and rain synergy, but then if you were going to rework a few Skellige cards, you would use it to support a different archetype, whether it's pirates and ships, for example. And you would allow another set of cards to potentially be viable in the meta. So yeah, that's pretty important. Both of those I think are feasible. One of the things I was asking in this question was, how would you like it packaged? And I think it's very clear that people would like to see this sort of reworked cards packaged in with expansion content, whether they affect it or not, directly with the same synergy. Because when we do partner reveals, like there are reveals going on today, it's one of the coolest periods in Gwent. Everyone's hyped up, everyone's excited. And there are hundreds of Gwent partners, but currently, on average of a 26-card expansion cycle, 19 to 20 cards that the community get to reveal. I, for one, as a Gwent partner, if they approach me when they were doing the draw and said, okay, everyone who hasn't got a draw, we put you in another pool and you will be able to reveal one of the reworks, you know what? I would very happily be sat here, you know, and I would happily do a reveal rework of card X, card Y, card Z, whatever it is. I would love that, because those things are locked in, right? The cards they're going to change, whether they're big power tweaks to bring things down and into line. We all know in the current meta there are a few cards that we're of the opinion are probably well above where they are now, but it isn't necessarily just a provision tweak that they're needed. Tunnel Drill, for example. Tunnel Drill, changing its provisions isn't going to be a fix for Tunnel Drill, in my opinion, because its ceiling is too high. The ability of what it does, albeit it has downsides, and you know, we all know how to play against it at this point, it doesn't stop it being ridiculously potent. But just saying, cool, put it to 9 provisions. It doesn't fix what it does. So a fundamental rework of a card like that is probably what ends up having to happen. I would love to be able to reveal those. It would be interesting, because even if you're revealing a rework of how things are going to change, it's still exciting content. And I think overall, that's what people, I think, want to see. So a good point's just been raised in chat. I know YouTube, you can't see this. We thought Sunset Wanderers needed a rework. Sunset Wanderers, I was adamant. I loved the ability, but I was adamant it needed a rework. I didn't think at 13 provisions it would take it out of the meta, and it did to an extent, a reasonable extent, and it's only in lists that it kind of makes sense in. But saying that, we just saw in the top 64 qualifiers, it was literally jammed into an overwhelming hunger deck with no synergy whatsoever to carry the list with points. I think if we hadn't had the amount of power creep we've had with some of the newer cards, I still don't think the provision change would have been relevant. I still think the card is probably too good, but we had some other cards that were so heavily power crept that it just wasn't necessary to see. I think the card probably still sees a pretty decent play rate. But I guess, as I've said, a provision makes a big difference, but either way, I think I would still love to be able to reveal those kind of changes, and I think it looks like the response is overwhelming that that stuff being packaged with it would be very welcome. The polls over here are just different, they're segregated by rank, so you can see obviously the responses here to these questions, which is interesting to see as well. So, do you like the current expansion style release? Now obviously there are more votes from people in Pro Rank, as you can see quite clearly, but it tells a very similar tale. Although players in Pro Rank prefer the 3 expansions per year option over the split expansion style here, every other one is very similar. So it just tells you the tale of which rank has voted which way. You can see the first choice is to keep it the same, but the overall total votes show 60% of people don't like it. So we will see. This information has been sent over to the Play Gwent team. They were very grateful for the response, and I will continue to run new polls when we get more response, more information on however the new expansions are going to look. When we see patches that are coming out, I will be doing polls probably 7 to 10 days into an expansion to say, okay, what's good? What do we think needs a tweak? And we will create more and more of this, and I will continue to feed it back to them, because ultimately, if we don't give them information, they're not going to know, right? They're not going to know. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do consider liking the video and subscribing on YouTube if you haven't, as there is more and more Gwent content that is going to be coming your way. That is all from me, guys, and I will see you all in the next one. Take care.